The death of God? Throughout my time in theological college and subsequently when I was an ordained priest and theologian, I was always interested in the edgy fringes of theology. I've spoken before about my interest in liberation theology, a radically political form of theology, heavily influenced by Marxist philosophy and the prophetic model of the Old Testament, among other things. I always looked critically at the Bible and the Christian tradition. I was always willing to challenge orthodoxy. If it was worth anything, it should be able to survive such challenges. One of the areas of radical theology was a type of theology known as the death of God theology. This theology recollects the words spoken by Zarathustra in the book by Friedrich Nietzsche, Also sprach Zarathustra, or Thus spoke Zarathustra. The prophet Zarathustra, sometimes known as Zoroaster, and hence the Persian religion Zoroastrianism, spends 10 years on a mountain top seeking wisdom. After that time, he decides to descend the mountain and spread his discovery. And the essence of this discovery is that God is dead. Later, the Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, during the Second World War, in his Letters and Papers from Prison, experiments with the idea of a worldly or religionless Christianity. Bonhoeffer talks about God allowing himself to be pushed out of the world and onto the cross. In the 1950s and 1960s, some theologians sought to develop these ideas further. They were seeking to respond to the perception that God was disappearing from the world, that the world was increasingly secular and appeared to have no place for God. There were, of course, various expositions of these ideas, but the central ideas are these. Some argued that the death of God was a real event that took place on the cross in the person of Jesus. God effectively takes himself out of the way, making way for a new secular Christianity focused more on human experience. This was seen by some as an opportunity to develop faith without the supernatural element, for which there seemed less and less room in the world. With the death of God, Christianity could now focus on humanistic values and ethical living. Christianity was reinterpreted in non-theistic terms. I read this as a reinterpretation of the Christian mythology surrounding the death of Jesus on the cross. A radicalization of this, in fact, which saw this as the actual death of God. The myth of the cross then becomes this. God allows himself to step aside, to die, at least symbolically, so that human beings may grow. As long as human beings are dependent upon God, even an extremely benevolent Father God, human beings would not be able to develop to their full potential. The resurrection of Christ then becomes the resurrection of man, the rising up of man, in the sense of the Son of Man that Jesus often spoke about. Now, whether God literally died or stepped aside to make room for human beings is a secondary issue. In fact, as I later came to interpret this, it was not some being called God that had to die, but the idea of God. It was this that was holding human beings back. In many ways, this reflects an excessively optimistic view of human beings, which was widespread in the 1950s and 1960s. Such optimism couldn't survive the events of the 1970s and subsequent decades. Now, in looking at this theology, I never embraced Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, the Superman, some superior kind of human being. Nor would I ever embrace Ayn Rand's concept of the heroic man or the ideal man. I've never had an excessively optimistic view of human beings. In fact, quite often I've had a very low opinion of human beings, and not just the lesser beings that people such as Ayn Rand might despise. As a product of evolution, the human species leaves a lot to be desired. We may well be about to drive ourselves to extinction. Nevertheless, I still think that, if not God himself, the idea of God at least is a hindrance to the development of human beings. I'm not for one moment suggesting that without God we'll suddenly become wonderful creatures who will fix everything. We almost certainly won't. But the concept of God, particularly as an omnipotent being in control of everything, can render us powerless. Why even try? The idea of some better world to come hinders us from trying to better this world. Apocalyptic beliefs not only make it pointless to try and fix the world, they make it almost blasphemous. It's as if we're almost defying God's will. God is going to fix things eventually, while letting quite a lot of bad things go unchecked in the meantime. And when he does fix things, it's going to involve quite a lot of breaking along the way. Look, we probably won't fix the world, but we have a better shot at it if we don't wait around for God to step in and fix it. Or maybe wipe it all out and start again.